and summary and review, we might end up rolling over all the time so that the last session just becomes a time to finish up. Which means, since I've kind of given up trying to have complete lessons in one session, I'm going to stop where it seems to make sense and take questions. And I'm not going to try to just rush through and finish. Hopefully that will, give you a chance to ask questions and have some discussion. So today we're going to try to finish up last week, what we started last week, which was Matthew chapters 8 and 9. And I said, if you remember nothing else, remember this. Does anybody remember what that was? Yes, there are 9 stories, 10 miracles, 3 groups of 3 stories with an interlude between each group of 3, right? And we had finished going through the first 2 groups of stories. The first group, we said, concluded with Matthew saying that Jesus was healing because he was fulfilling Isaiah 53, where it says, he has borne our diseases and taken our pain, right? And then there was a brief interlude where there were people who wanted to follow Jesus, and I said that section was about them misunderstanding who Jesus is as the Son of Man, which is why they didn't understand what it meant to follow him. And that started a section of miracles where the authority of Jesus was revealing his identity, but people were not understanding. So the disciples in the boat were saying, who is this, right? What kind of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? And then the demons said, he's the Son of God. But the people ended up asking him to leave their town. And then Jesus came back. And again, the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. And people thought, God let people forgive sins, which is weird, right? That's not what Jesus was saying. He was saying Jesus as the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. And so that section was about misunderstanding Jesus' authority as the Son of Man, right? And that was the second section, and that brings us to the second interlude after the second group of 3 stories. This is in chapter 9, verses 9 through 17. This is a section where Jesus first calls Matthew the tax collector, which transitions nicely into Jesus socializing with tax collectors and sinners. And the Pharisees take issue. And this is the first time that people openly question Jesus. Right? In the previous story at 9:3, the scribes, when they were, unhappy with Jesus saying he forgives sins, the scribes are saying to themselves. In Matthew 9:3 it says, the scribes said to themselves, and Jesus responded because he saw their thoughts and says, why do you think evil things in your hearts? Right? So at that point, the questioning of Jesus was still inward. It was still in their minds and in their thoughts. But here they say it out loud to his disciples. They say, why? They ask him directly why Jesus is eating and fellowshipping with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus responds by telling them that he has come for the sick, the sinners, not the righteous and the healthy. Then even the disciples of John the Baptist take issue with Jesus' disciples not fasting. And Jesus uses the occasion to claim that a new era has dawned. 9:16 through 17, basically Jesus is saying the old way of doing things is for the old order. That's where Jesus talks about putting new... I'm sorry, I just had to pause because Dave Homeland just walked in. I didn't expect to see him at church so soon, so I was... Praise God. Thank the Lord that he can come. Oh, welcome. So yeah, that part is where Jesus was talking about putting new wine into new wineskins. And so basically Jesus is saying the old way of doing things is for the old order, and in the new order there are new ways of doing things. So this interlude in which Jesus is being openly questioned leads to the last group of 3 stories. And this is in 9:18 through 34. The first story is 9:18 through 26, where it's 2 miracles rolled into one. It's the raising of the girl and the healing of a bleeding woman. All right. And we see in the Gospel of Mark the same 2 stories are the same 2 miracles are combined into one story there as well. And so apparently these 2 miracles were always remembered as one story. Luke also has these 2 miracles together. So there was a girl who had died, and Jesus was on his way to raise her, and a woman who was bleeding, had been bleeding for a long time, came and touched his clothes and was healed, right? So those 2 stories are combined together. And if we remember back to last week, we were saying how the stories end give us a clue into why that particular story was put where it's put, or why it was included, right? So without looking, what do you think the conclusion of that story is? That story of the 2 miracles, the raising of the girl and the healing of the woman. No one remembers, right? And the report of this went through all that district, is the conclusion of that story. So this is about this, Jesus' miracles and his healings are finally starting to spread, like the news of his ability to do these things is starting to spread widely, right? 9:27 through 31 is the second story in that group. And it's the story of the healing of the 2 blind men. The blind men called Jesus Son of David. If you've been following what I've been saying, this is significant because people have not clearly identified who Jesus is, right? We started all the way back with the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where people were saying he has authority, he's not like the scribes, but they don't say what that means, right? They don't know who he is, they just know he's not like the scribes. And then in the last section, we already said, he's the Son of God, and he's the Son of Man, but they don't know this, they don't understand. And so this is the first time that Jesus is addressed as the Son of Man in the whole gospel, by someone speaking to him, a person, right? So, but obviously, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the gospel, the genealogy, son of David, son of Abraham, was the first thing that was said about Jesus. So as a reader, you're supposed to know this, but you're kind of waiting for the people in the story to catch up to that, right? And this is kind of the first time you're seeing that beginning to happen. So the healing, Jesus specifically asks if they believe. He asked the 2 blind men, "Do you believe?" Right? This is the first time and the only time in Matthew that Jesus requires faith before healing. Faith has been a factor in some, but not all of the stories thus far. The faith of the centurion who had his slave healed was commended. The disciples are rebuked for their little faith in the boat. Jesus saw the faith of the people who brought the paralytic man, right? And Jesus says that the bleeding woman was saved by her faith. But this is the first time Jesus requires faith before he heals. And then once he heals them, he warns them not to tell anyone. In Matthew, Jesus telling people not to tell others about him is also seen as fulfillment of Scripture. We'll see that a little bit later. So we'll come to that in a bit. It seems that according to Matthew, part of the reason he told people not to tell others about him is to avoid confrontation. We'll see that again a little bit later. But it makes good sense here that Jesus begins to say, like I said last time as well, that in Mark, it's very clear from the beginning when Jesus heals, he tells people not to tell anyone. But in Matthew, he hasn't been telling us that, right? Matthew doesn't tell us that Jesus tells the people he heals not to tell anyone. This is the first time that happens. And it makes good sense here because, again, we've seen that the responses to Jesus have been diverse. There is beginning to be opposition, right? There's beginning to be understanding of who he is as Son of Man, as Son of David, but there's also beginning to be open opposition. And so it makes good sense here that Jesus would say, don't tell anyone, because he doesn't want to be confronted, and he wants to avoid that. He has been teaching and demonstrating his authority without claiming any known messianic titles for himself, right? Jesus has not said anything about himself being the Son of David or the Son of God. The only exception is the Son of Man. He's been using that about himself, but I argued last time that was not well understood. And so Jesus does not try to convince people that he is the Messiah by telling people that he is the Messiah. He demonstrates his authority and leaves it up to them to make sense of his authority for themselves. And that's the whole kind of journey that we've been looking at. How do these people make sense of his authority? Do they come to the right conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, or not? And we've seen that the responses have been varying and increasingly diverging. So the conclusion of this story with the healing of the two blind men, without looking, what do you think the conclusion of that story is? Verse 31, they went away and spread his fame through all that district. Through all that district is the exact same expression as at the end of the previous story. And so, again, we're seeing there's momentum, right? The reports of his fame are starting to spread through all that district. It seems all positive, but there is still no mention of the crowd's identification of Jesus or understanding of what his authority implies. Obviously, the blind man identified him as the Son of David, but if you go back, I think it was last week I said, in the Gospel of Matthew, the crowds act like a character, right? And we're trying to see their development through the story. And the crowds, at this point, we don't really see anything in terms of positive identification of Jesus. And so we're kind of still waiting, right? And this all comes to a head in the last story of this section. 9:32 through 34. Jesus casts out the demon of a mute man who is demon-possessed. And this last story is very brief. It does not even narrate the exorcism. It says, when the demon had been cast out. Like that's as much as you get in terms of describing that Jesus cast out the demon. It just assumes that obviously he cast out the demon. But when the demon had been cast out, right? And the point is almost entirely in the reactions in this story. On the one hand, the crowds marvel. Never was anything like this seen in Israel. On the other hand, the Pharisees say he casts out demons by the prince of demons. The third group of stories was introduced by the interlude where the Pharisees openly question Jesus' association with tax collectors and sinners, and end with the Pharisees accusing him of having demonic powers. And these reactions, right? The crowd saying nothing like this we've ever seen before. And the Pharisees accusing Jesus of demonic powers. That conclusion not only ends the third story, it ends the third group of stories, and it ends the whole section, basically, right? So we said 5 through 7, Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' word ministry, 8 and 9, Jesus' healing and miracles, demonstrating his authority. This conclusion of the crowds and their reactions and the Pharisees and their reactions concludes that whole section of 8 and 9 of Jesus' miracles. So at this point, we have these diverging reactions after all of Jesus' authority has been revealed. The Pharisees' minds on who Jesus is already made up by the end of chapter 9 and does not change until the end of the book. The narrative course to the crucifixion, right? So part of what Matthew has to do in his gospel is everybody already knows that Jesus was crucified, right? What he has to show in his story is how we got there, right? How did this happen, right? That's part of what he's trying to do by telling this story. And that path to crucifixion is already set by the end of chapter 9 because the Pharisees have already decided that Jesus is casting out demons by the power of demons. So chapters 8 and 9 is, especially the end of chapter 9, is a crucial kind of turning point, right? We've been seeing the crowds trying to make sense of Jesus' identity revealed in his authority, and there's been diverging opinions, but one opinion of that, the Pharisees, is that he's doing this by the power of demons. We need to, eventually, we will need to get rid of him, right? So that's Matthew 8 and 9. Seems like a good place to pause and take some questions, if you have any. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah, that is what the section is about. The reason I said I want you to try to remember the structure of this section is because, like you said, I think the structure helps us to bear in mind where we are in this story, right? So sometimes, we could, we've all heard the Sermon on the Mount, or we've probably heard it being preached on, or we've read it ourselves, or we've read about it. And different details and focuses of what people say about it are all probably true, but we don't remember all of it, but we know Matthew 5 through 7 is Sermon on the Mount, right? And so what I'm trying to do is trying to give that kind of overview of the structure of Matthew so that you can remember how the story progresses through the structure. Right, and so I argued chapters 1 through 4 is kind of a long introduction, and then 5 through 7 is the Sermon on the Mount, and 8 through 9 are these miracle stories. And when you have that kind of table of contents in your head, hopefully that can help you remember how the story moves and progresses. Right, so that's why I said that it is kind of striking, I think, to think of this section as having 9 stories with 3 groups of 3. It's easy to remember, and when you remember that, I think you will hopefully remember the rest of the lesson, which is that this is about Jesus' authority and people's diverging opinions of him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's the first time that any of the characters in the story use it. So again, I said Matthew 1:1. This is Jesus Christ, Son of David. So it's already there, but as any of the characters use it, this is the first time. What is the significance of it? There's probably a lot. One, I think the way I've been trying to present this section is that there is some clear development in understanding of who he is at this point, right? So, and it kind of needs to happen, right? Because Matthew is wrapping up a section on Jesus' miracles. The next section is a bunch of, some of it is Jesus' long speeches, right? And so I argued even at the end of the Sermon on the Mount that the sermon, as important as the moral content of it is, according to the way Matthew tells it, it's significant that Jesus tells it, right? Because it reveals Jesus' authority. And so even before he gets into another section, he wants, I think, us to know that all his authority and miracles and healing have been revealing something about who he is. And there are some people who are getting it at this point. Any other questions? Okay, so that brings us to the next section. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 10 through 13. And so, let's see. So a brief outline of this section, chapters 10 through 13. Chapter 10 is the commissioning discourse, where Jesus commissions his 12 disciples to go out on mission. Chapter 11 is about, just broadly speaking, doubting and unbelief. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 21 are the Sabbath controversies. And then chapter 12, 22 through 50 is more unbelief. I just said more unbelief. And then chapter 13. What's chapter 13 about? Parables, right? So I've preached a whole series on the whole chapter now, so we're not going to go through chapter 13 in depth. Okay, but chapter 10, commissioning discourse. Chapter 11, doubting unbelief. Chapter 12, 1 through 21, Sabbath controversies, more unbelief, and parables. What is the thread that ties this section together? I think the thread is Matthew 11:12 says this. It says, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." Now, ESV has a footnote on suffered violence. Do you all see that? It says, there's a footnote there on suffered violence, and it says, or has been coming violently. This is Matthew 11, verse 12. Right? So the verse could say, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, or it could say, the kingdom of heaven has been coming violently. Those are two very different things, right? This kingdom is either suffering violence or is the one that's being aggressive, right? And that's because scholars are unsure. What is the best way to translate this expression? One commentator says that the verse is, without a doubt, one of the New Testament's great conundrums. I said last time, I think, that when scholars work on something in the Bible, they always say, like, the problem I'm working on is the hardest problem ever. But this is one of those passages where, like, people aren't sure what it means, right? In the New Testament, the word that is translated suffered violence occurs only here and in the parallel passage in Luke 16:16. But in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, it occurs 10 times. And it usually has the sense of acting with force against someone's will or breaking through forcefully. So, for example, it is a word used to say a man took a woman and lay with her by force, speaking about rape. Right. But it is also the word used to say that a host compelled a guest to stay longer than he wanted. You've seen those stories in the Old Testament where a guest is traveling by and the host says, please come and stay with us. And then the person says, I have to get going. And he says, please stay. You know, it's getting late. You don't want to travel in the night. Spend the night, go tomorrow, right? And then it says the host compelled them to stay, right? That word that was translated suffered violence is used in that context. The host forced the guest to stay, basically, right? And at Mount Sinai, it is used to say that the people of Israel and the priests should not break through and go up to the mountain, right? Only Moses and Aaron were allowed up the mountain, and the people must not force their way through and go up the mountain, right? So it's used in a variety of different ways. It's not the force is not necessarily negative, right? In every case, the subject of the verb is the one that is acting forcefully, not the one that is receiving forceful action upon itself, right? In Matthew 11:12, the subject is the kingdom of heaven. That means that the kingdom of heaven is the one that is acting forcefully, rather than the one that's receiving forceful action on itself. So I think the translation in the footnote is a better translation of the verse, right? So from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing or forcefully breaking through. The end of the verse says, and the violent take it by force, right? And people who think that the first part is about the kingdom suffering violence point to this part and say, see, violence is being done against the kingdom. But the expression there, take it by force, occurs 2 other times in Matthew, one of which is significant for the interpretation of this verse. And we're going to look at it a little bit later as well. But in chapter 12, verse 29, Jesus says, how can someone enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? Then indeed he may plunder his house, right? So the word translated plunder is the word that's translated here, take it by force. In 12:29, the person who enters the strong man's house is Jesus. And the strong man that is being bound is Satan. And so it is Jesus and people like him or with him that are doing the plundering, right? Because they bind the strong man, that is Satan, and taking what was belonging to Satan at the time. All that to say, I think 11:12 should be translated as, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully breaking through, and strong men are taking it by force, right? Or plundering it to make it their possession by force. The kingdom is forcefully advancing. We spent some time looking at that verse because I think that is the key that binds the whole section of chapter 10 through 13 together. It is that the kingdom of heaven is advancing forcefully. The message of John the Baptist was, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near, right? And that was the message of Jesus at the beginning of his public ministry. And now he's saying the kingdom is advancing forcefully since the time of John. And so this section, in a nutshell, is about spiritual warfare. It's about the kingdom advancing forcefully through spiritual warfare. And that, I think, is the thread that ties the 4 chapters, 10 through 13, together. And if we keep that in mind, that'll help us understand each of the sections. So, we come to the commissioning passage, which is from 9:35 through 10:42. And if we go back to chapters 8 and 9, that section was about Jesus' authority, which divided opinions about who Jesus is, right? So by the end of that section, the stage is set for spiritual warfare, right? 9:35 is the summary statement about Jesus' public ministry. I mentioned that last week as well, and the week before, right? 9:35 says, "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction." So that's a summary statement of all of Jesus' public ministry. And there was a similar one all the way back in chapter 4 that encloses the Sermon on the Mount and a section on Jesus' authority. And then we have 9:36 through 10:4, which is a short transition paragraph, or a paragraph that sets up and introduces the commissioning discourse. And this is what it says, 9:36 through 10:2, 10:1. Let's just read up to there. "When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.' And he called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction." And then it lists the names of the 12 disciples. But if we go back to that expression, like sheep without a shepherd, if you know your Old Testament, that imagery should feel familiar, right? It's an expression that occurs 3 times in the Old Testament. 1 Kings 22:17 and 2 Chronicles 18:16 are parallel passages. They tell the same story, and that's why the 2 occasions are there. And that passage is the story of Micaiah the prophet, prophesying against Ahab, the king of Israel. Ahab insists on taking Israel to war against Aram. And Micaiah prophesies that Ahab will die in battle and that Israel will be without a king and they will be scattered in the mountains. Ahab dies in battle, and Micaiah's prophecy that Israel will be like sheep without a shepherd is fulfilled. I don't know if you remember the section that we did on genealogy. You've probably forgotten a lot of that by now. But when we were looking at the genealogy, I said that after David, it is all downhill, right? The names of the kings there, you see it and you see like David is like the pinnacle of Israel, and the names, you just see it and you associate this downward trend thereafter. And then after the exile, there aren't any more kings, right? And so when Jesus says they're like sheep without a shepherd, he's saying they're without a king, right? And he wants to lead them as their king. He's coming to a people without a king, and he wants to lead them. So the 2 occasions in the Old Testament That's where that comes from. But the first time the expression sheep without a shepherd occurs is in Numbers 27:17. And the context there is that Israel has journeyed through the wilderness and are at the cusp of entering the promised land. And God tells Moses to look at the promised land because he will not get to enter. Moses was going to die outside the promised land. So Moses responds, beginning at Numbers 27:15. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." Moses is asking God to raise up a leader to lead the people in the promised land after he is dead. And God's answer in verse 18 is, "So the Lord said to Moses, 'Take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him.'" The man who will shepherd God's people in the promised land, who will lead them in battle against the Canaanites, is Joshua. In Greek, Joshua and Jesus is the same name. In Greek, Numbers 27:18 literally says, "Take for yourself Jesus, the son of Nun, who has the Spirit in himself, and put your hand on him." Remember, I argued that Matthew 1-7 was telling the story of Jesus as a retelling of the story of the Pentateuch, right? We saw Jesus fulfilling Genesis in his genealogy, in his birth, fulfilling the Exodus in his going to Egypt and coming out, fulfilling Numbers in his wilderness 40 days, and then the Sermon on the Mount, I argue, that looks like Deuteronomy, right? What happens after the Pentateuch? Joshua conquers Canaan, right? And so at this point, after all that, Jesus is like Joshua, who is going to lead his people so that they would not be like sheep without a shepherd. And he will lead them into battle, right? Conquering the promised land. And then he commissions 12 disciples. Does 12 people remind you of anything? The 12 tribes of Israel, right? Matthew 10:2 says, "The names of the 12 apostles are these," right? And the closest parallel to this expression is from Numbers 1:5. It says, "And these are the names of the men who shall assist you," and then lists 12 people, leaders of each tribe. So the 12 disciples are the new leaders of the new Israel that Jesus is appointing to go with him. Matthew alone tells us of the names of the 12 disciples right before Jesus sends them out. In Mark, the 12 disciples are named much earlier in the story, at Mark chapter 3, and then Jesus' discourse where he sends them out only comes in Mark chapter 6. In Luke as well, the 12 disciples are first named in Luke 6, and then Jesus sends them out in Luke 9. But in Matthew, he gives you the 12 names, and then he sends them. Right? Matthew wants you to see the connection between the 12 as the leaders of the new Israel and the sending out. And look at the authority that Jesus gives them. Chapter 10, verse 1 says, "And he called to him his disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction." It's not so clear in the English, but in the Greek, it's the authority over unclean spirits that gives them the ability to cast them out, but also the ability to heal diseases. It is the authority of unclean spirits that allows the healing of all sorts of diseases. So healings and exorcisms are primarily spiritual, according to Matthew. And healings and exorcisms are primarily about spiritual warfare against unclean spirits. And then there is the long speech that elaborates on how they are to go. I'll try to be quick with this. Interestingly, the first thing Jesus says, according to Matthew, is, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So this is first a conquest of the land of God's people, right, by the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Jesus talks about what they should do and how they should go. He talks about healing and casting out demons. He talks about how they should not take extra money or extra clothes, how they should stay in a person's house, what to do when they are not accepted, all that stuff. And then he says, "I am sending you out as sheep among wolves, but that they should not fear." And he says in verses 34 through 35, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." The sending out of the 12 in Matthew is framed as sending out into spiritual warfare, the bringing of the sword. Right? Do the disciples have success? Do the disciples go and what happens? Actually, Matthew doesn't even tell us that the disciples went, right? At the end of Jesus' speech, Matthew 11:1 says, "When Jesus had finished instructing the 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities." And then the focus is straight back on Jesus in Matthew. No mention of the disciples going or coming back and reporting what they did. Mark says that the disciples went and came back and reported the success they had. The apostles, Mark 6:30 says, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught." Luke actually has Jesus sending out the disciples twice. First, he sends out the 12 in Luke 9, and then he sends out 72 in Luke 10. Both times they return. At the end of Luke 9:10 says, "On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done." Luke 10:17 says, "The 72 returned with joy, saying, 'Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name.'" But Matthew doesn't have an equivalent of that. Matthew doesn't even tell us that the disciples even came back. For Matthew, what Jesus said about sending them out is more significant than the fact that they went and did as Jesus told them to do. So the whole discourse is framed as Jesus, like Joshua, leading the people of God so that they will not be like sheep without a shepherd, leading the 12 leaders of the 12 tribes of the new Israel into spiritual warfare in the land of Canaan. The kingdom of heaven is forcefully advancing. And so that sets up the whole section in Matthew 10-13 as a section of spiritual warfare. And since this is about spiritual warfare, there is going to be a lot of doubt and unbelief. And that really is what the section is about. Jesus constantly fighting against unbelief. Right. So I'm going to stop there. I'm a couple minutes over, but we'll pick up from there next time with Matthew 11. Let me pray and we'll close. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for your word. We thank you for Jesus, that he does not leave us like sheep without a shepherd, that he leads us in battle, and that he fights our enemies for us. Help us to put our trust in him and follow him. For we ask in his name. Amen. Thank you.